Hey, I'm Dr. Scott, and this is The Stories We Tell Ourselves, a podcast where we have real, honest conversations about mental health, relationships, and personal growth. Each week, we'll explore practical wisdom on emotions, trauma, addiction, and neuroscience based on real questions submitted by you, the listeners. Disclaimer, this is important to keep in mind. I'm a therapist in practice, but I'm not a therapist in this particular role. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It does not replace professional clinical advice. So let's get into it today. Doing things a little differently than I've done the first few podcasts. Been taking a number of questions from listeners, and rather than focus on one particular question, I've kind of grouped them in themes and tried to focus on some particular issues. One of the issues that have come up pretty frequently in the last month or two is the topic of leadership and how this applies from a therapeutic or psychological lens from human behavior on leadership. I had questions related to burnout, how to be a calm leader, how to create a healthy culture, how to stay grounded, in conflict, how to do conflict in a healthy way. So many different areas that we're focused on. So I want to focus a bit on leadership, but we're going to get into leadership not only in a corporate setting or as an entrepreneur or a leader of an organization of some kind, but also we practice leadership in a variety of areas in our life, whether it be through parenting, sometimes in a relationship, and different types of relationships. And so I want to make sure we cover a number of different topics here today related to leadership. You know, one of the most important components of leadership, what I think of leadership from a psychological lens, from a human behavioral neuroscience perspective, is the ability to be a non-anxious presence. Now, what do I mean by that? Anxiety, we typically think of, I have some anxiety, some perceived threat about the future, and that certainly is anxiety. But anxiety is much bigger. Anytime we have this unsettledness, this tension, this fear or this unrest inside of our mind, our heart, our soul, when we're in our business or when we're with friendships or when parenting, right? That is, I'm calling that anxiety, right? I'm enlarging the parameters here and using this more in a general sense when I call it anxiety. Now, I didn't come up with this on my own, right? This non-anxious presence. This really comes from some brilliant work by Murray Bowen and family systems theory out of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so on. And Edwin Friedman's work in his book, Generation to Generation and Failure of Nerve. Both are fabulous reads in terms of leadership and differentiation and maturity and those sort of topics. So, this is something that I've got tremendous training in my graduate work. I began to put into practice in my first few years as a therapist. And I continue to use this in a number of different ways, whether it be with couples, whether it be with leadership, whether it be with, folks that come in who are entrepreneurs and leaders and trying to create a certain culture, or these topics of burnout or conflict resolution. So this topic of non-anxious presence really begins to apply to a number of areas in our lives. And so I think it's, some of the healthiest people that I have worked with related to leadership. When I think about what do they possess, what quality do they possess that's the strongest quality I would say that they possess as a leader, and I would say that they're a non-anxious presence. Edwin Friedman said there's three qualities that make up a great leader. One, they have a vision, right? They have a clear idea of who they are, what they want, where they're going, right? They have a vision. Number two, they know how to articulate that vision clearly. They know how to communicate that to their people in a way that their people get it, they understand it, they capture it, right? And it's easy and understandable, right? So they have a vision. They know how to articulate that vision to the people around them. And the third and most important piece is he said that they're a non-anxious presence. They stay calm in conflict, right? They may experience anxiety. Certainly they do, right? They may still experience uncertainty. They may experience fear, but they don't allow the anxiety to make their decisions, right? Friedman would say something, along the lines that every human being experiences some type of anxiety. The question is, what is leading your life? Are your values leading your life? Are the way you want to live leading your life? the way you want to lead leading your life, or is anxiety in charge and you're unconscious of it? That's important. Many people aren't conscious of their anxiety as a leader, right? That's not something that's taught in leadership very much, is this human behavioral concept. We think of more or business ideas and culture and language that's not necessarily psychological in nature. But when you think about this, the human person and the whole of a human person, certainly we have emotions, behavior, feelings that are all integrated in this. And so, over the last 20, 30 years, fortunately, we've seen corporations and leaders thinking of themselves more as a whole person rather than this more separate personal and professional sort of life. They're able to kind of see themselves as a whole person in that role. So I think that's important to keep in mind, is that emotions, anxiety, cause us to make decisions many times, fear that causes us to make decisions that end up costing us time, they cost us relationships, they cost us the business, they cost us money, right? This fear and anxiety, if you're not conscious of it, you're not noticing it, you're not being aware of it, it's driving, it's in the background and kind of driving decisions. So one good step of leadership is learning to be conscious of this unconscious part of you that may be driving some of your decisions. Now, we could think about that in terms of leading an organization, whether it's a community, a smaller community, whether it's a church community or a synagogue or another type of spiritual community. We could say that in terms of a small business, even a large corporation, right? When anxiety is in the system, right, that's when things become problematic. Anxiety has a way of being contagious. I think a lot of human behavior has a way of being contagious. Typically, if we're around somebody who's really positive or really grateful, that can rub off on us as well. But anxiety has a way of being contagious. And one of the foundational, ideas in family systems theory, Murray Bowen's work, is how emotions spread, through a system. And that's important to consider, that as a leader, it's important to be aware, whatever type of leadership you're doing, whether you're being a parent or you're leading an organization or a group or a small business, that you're thinking in terms of emotions spread throughout the system, right? Have you ever walked into a room, for example, I'm sure you have, where two people had just been arguing, and you could see on their faces, obviously, that there's tension there, but you can also feel it in the room, right? You can feel it. Our nervous systems have a way of talking to us, right? Nothing was officially said in that moment, right? You just know that everybody feels uneasy in that moment. And, our nervous system has a way of continually communicating to us. It speaks to us. We are influenced by our emotions. Right? Anxiety has a way of being contagious. If someone is anxious or in fear, it rubs off on the rest of the system. If a leader is highly anxious and being driven by fear, the people can feel that. And the brain likes safety and security and predictability. And so when they see a leader that's not operating with that level of calmness and clarity of vision, that's when they begin to feel uneasy themselves. And that creates all sorts of unease. And typically you'll see people begin to talk to other people within the system and kind of triangle. Sometimes they start looking to leave that environment because it creates too much anxiety inside of them. And that stability and consistency that their brain needs in that environment becomes problematic, right? People like predictability. That's what the brain likes. And it also likes that sense of safety. So calmness has a way, if you allow it, to be contagious as well, right? Every room you enter, we contribute something. We either increase the anxiety in that room by the behavior we bring in, or we decrease it. That is leadership, right? No matter what environment you're in, you either increase the anxiety and the tension, or you bring calmness to that environment, right? Leadership is not about trying to control people. I want to highlight that as well. It's more about influencing the emotional climate, right? And that's what we're trying to focus on today, is that as a human being, we have a role, especially as we mature, we get into second half of life, or we're raising kids, or we're coaching a team of kids, right? I remember coaching my kids' soccer teams for years, and I would find myself getting frustrated on the sideline when the tension rose, my anxiety was up, and I'm getting frustrated with the ref, right? Or I'm getting angry at one of the players, right, on the other team or whatever, right? And I had to work on calming my anxiety because this team, this group of young young men were watching what I'm doing, right? They're looking at the coach as the leader. So, and certainly had to work on that even in that environment, right? So that's incredibly important there. But I want you to think. I want to share a story with you. Let's think about a situation in business where you're leading a company, you're leading a small business, or even a large business, and your biggest client unexpectedly leaves. Your revenue drops. Employees begin, talking in the background, whispering. There's murmurs, right? People are talking to one another. People start wondering whether they're going to lose their jobs. And, one leader begins to react, right? One type of leader begins to react. They panic. They start over explaining. They start pulling people into the office and having conversations and creating more anxiety in the system as a way of trying to managing it in some way. They change direction every few days on what to do and how to manage this in a very uncertain environment. Every meeting feels chaotic because this leader is feeling this sense of chaotic. I'm sure you've been there at some point in your life. I certainly have, right? It's a part of growing as a human being and a leader. Now imagine another leader, right? Who they gather everyone together and they say, I know this is unsettling. They speak to what is going on, right? They're honest about it. They don't give all the answers. But here's what we do know, they might say. They say, here's our plan. And they start communicating thoughtful action and decisions. They communicate honestly. And they say, this is who we are. We got to stay true to who we are, our vision, our brand, our next steps. We got to trust the process. So, right, in an environment like that, when you have a leader, the uncertainty hasn't disappeared. It hasn't gone away. The leader has just made a decision not to let the anxiety become the loudest voice in the room. And that's important to consider. That's what Murray Bowen called differentiation. Now, differentiation, what is differentiation? This is a concept, I think, that has to do with emotional maturity, that we're all on a continuum, he would say, of increasing in differentiation, meaning we learn how to be a separate self and be connected to the person at the same time. Many people struggle with this. Being a self, getting clear on who they are, what they want, what they need, what they value, having good boundaries, and also being connected to the other in some way. That togetherness, individuality forces that are a part of every marriage dynamic. They're a part of relationships, even as a parent. They're a part of relationships with any system or organization, right? So differentiation just simply means that I can stay connected to you, but I'm not emotionally fused. I'm not losing myself in you, and I'm not emotionally disconnected either. I'm living in that middle ground between the two. So take a moment. Think about that in your life. Think about a time or a relationship that you're emotionally connected and you lose yourself. And what happens there? Or you're standing up for yourself, but you're not very emotionally connected to that person, right? You're pretty disconnected. But think of a time that you've been able to do both. Staying emotionally connected, staying in touch, and also being able to be grounded and true to your own, not only your feelings, but you're true to your wants and your needs and staying emotionally regulated. That means that in that environment, you can hear your fear, right? You can hear it without it becoming, overwhelming, right? Without becoming fearful. You can hear and listen to the anger that you feel without becoming angry. You can hear the disappointment, right? You're an observer of this, right? You see and hear and feel the disappointment without abandoning your values. Again, differentiation doesn't mean that we create emotional distance. It doesn't mean being cold. It means we allow ourselves to be even more compassionate and connected, but we're no longer reacting to the anxiety itself. Now, when I think about ways how to do this, now we've got this concept of being a good leader means being a non-anxious presence, being grounded, being connected, leading through groundedness and more of a calmness than leading through fear, not making decisions out of emotional reactivity, right? Now, we get better with this with age. We get better with training ourselves to get better with this, but this is a constant process as a human being. Sometimes we do this better than others. I'd like to say that I do this on my good days pretty good. On my bad days, I don't do it very well, right? So it's a process that we're in, and it's something to keep in mind. It's a goal that we're working towards, on a daily basis. But when I think about what are some ways that we could do this effectively, like what does this actually practically look like? How do we do this effectively in our daily lives? Now, one of the therapies out there that have become more popular in the last 20 years that I think we could apply here is dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT. If you struggle with emotional dysregulation, trouble with maintaining your emotions and your reactivity, your emotions kind of drive your behavior. DBT is a wonderful type of therapy to really study and learn because it allows you to create more this tolerance for stress, this creating mindfulness practices, right? Increasing more effectiveness in your relationships, right? It does a number of things. It teaches you to do a number of things really well in a way of improving your relationships and your relationship to those relationships, how you react to those relationships. So I think it gives us a really practical framework for this. And so I want to talk for a few minutes here about DBT. Friedman, I think Edwin Friedman, if we go back to that, did a great job in talking about what maturity looks like. I think DBT teaches how to practice it, how to put it into action. So the combination of the two of these, I think, is a really good fit. And this really comes just from my years as a therapist, 25 plus years now. I've studied a lot of different theories. As a therapist, I work with a lot of different theories, and DBT is something that I've gotten more training in the last number of years because I just see so much effective. I've seen it really help clients tremendously. I've had clients say to me, as they've done DBT for a year or longer, they'll say to me, there's no way I could have stayed in this relationship that I've been in for the last year if I didn't have DBT practices. I would have emotionally reacted. I would have blown this thing up. I would have walked away. But I've been able to stay calm and work through this problem, right? And so really effective work. I really appreciate the practical piece. Therapy sometimes can get a little too theoretical in nature, and I think this offers a version of therapy that's very practical. So let's get into it. So what is DBT practice? I talked a bit more about mindfulness related to DBT. Now, mindfulness from a DBT perspective just means that you're becoming aware. You're becoming aware, asking yourself, what am I feeling right now? What are my emotions? What is my body telling me? What is the story of anxiety telling me? Most of us, we notice the other's emotions before we notice our own. We notice their emotional anxiety, their anger, their fear, and we take that on. Right? But mindfulness says that we can slow down and we are aware of ourselves. We have a relationship with ourselves where we recognize what's happening inside of us first. Now, that's important work to do, right? I know that's something that for me, I'm continually working on it. 53 years old and been a therapist for 25 years and done my own therapy over the years, right? Still in practice with this. This is not easy. You don't just get this. You don't just come to a place of being proficient at this. This is a work in progress, like most things in life, right? It's a process over time. So, mindfulness has a way of slowing us down enough to recognize what's happening inside of us. Because we can't regulate something we don't recognize, we're not aware of, we're not conscious of, right? And DBT has this language that I think is incredibly important. They talk about being in your wise mind. Now, this is a framework in your thinking that I think can be very, very effective, right? DBT talks about three ways of making decisions. You can either make decisions from an emotional mind, which says, right, it's emotionally reactive. I need to fix this immediately. There's anxiety. There's that you don't want this feeling inside of you. You want it to go away, right? And that's where we go when we're in our emotional mind. So think in terms of that. When I'm in my emotional mind, this is how I react. Reasonable mind, from a DBT perspective, says that we ignore our emotions, right? We just kind of push them away, right? We are more cognitive in our approach. And at times, this could be actually effective in some cases when we're in crisis to be a little more cognitive in our approach. But if we stay there, we ignore emotions and we're not including and incorporating all of the leadership sort of skills that we need in that moment to stay connected to the people in some way, right? Connected to our kids, connected to the team that we're leading, connected to our organization or the creating that culture we want. But wise mind, which is where you want to live, says I can acknowledge emotions while still making wise decisions. Every leader has to ask, right? Am I reacting or am I responding? Now, I can't go into all these dynamics of emotional mind, a reasonable mind, a wise mind, but I would encourage you to look it up. I would encourage you to do some studying on DBT and how you might want to apply this in your life. Additionally, DBT does a good job of talking about distress tolerance, right? And I think this might be the most overlooked skill as a leader in any capacity. And one of the questions that we think about with distress tolerance is, can I tolerate discomfort without immediately trying to eliminate it? How difficult is that? When we feel certain emotions we don't like, we want to run from them. We want to numb them. We want to escape them. We want them to go away. People come into therapy, help me make this go away, right? And many times it's not about making it go away. It's about learning to go through it. It's learning to process it. It's learning to sit and tolerate the discomfort. It's enlarging your capacity as a human being to sit with, tolerate discomfort. Think about how often we react simply because we don't like feeling uncomfortable. Take a moment and think about that, right? Some people do this better than others, but most of us don't do this very well. We react out of our emotion at times. Someone criticizes us and we defend ourselves. Someone becomes upset with us and we rush to fix it, right? Someone cries or gets upset and we immediately change our boundary and give up kind of ourself, right? Or they get angry and we shift our boundary. Or they get disappointed and we shift our boundary, right? We give up ourselves in some way. What if instead we paused? We got more clear on what we were feeling through that mindfulness approach. We slowed down our breathing. We waited a few seconds. And sometimes wisdom arrives after anxiety settles. It may not be in that moment. You may need a moment to say, I need a moment to think about that. And I don't want to respond to that right now. I need a moment to think about it. But thank you for sharing that sort of thing. So it's important to getting in wise mind means that you need to calm your emotional anxiety and take a step back sometimes and reflect about how you want to respond to the people in your life. I also want to just talk about one other piece about DBT is this emotional regulation piece, right? Going back to this, in some ways, it's this mindfulness has some integration in this, asking yourself, am I exhausted? Am I overwhelmed? Have I slept? Have I eaten? Have I exercised? Have I taken good care of myself? Right? Am I working on actually calming my nervous system? Right? Because if I'm not emotionally regulated in myself, I got to check in with myself and say, what does rest look like in my life lately? What is my spiritual practices been like lately? My connection to God, my connection to myself and my emotions. Am I taking good care of myself? That holistic way of viewing things from an emotional, spiritual, physical, lens is important to incorporate and consider, right? And our bodies matter, right? Our nervous system teaches us things if we'll listen to it. So I want to pull some of this together. We've talked about leadership in a variety of capacities. I want to just talk a bit about parenting because I've had a number of questions out there related to parenting as well. And I can't answer all of them on the podcast, but I can try to summarize a few things here, and hopefully this will be helpful to you all out there that have submitted questions related to parenting. But I think in light of what we've been talking about, if we stay with this theme of differentiation, emotional regulation, non-reactivity, being a non-anxious presence, paying attention to your own relationship with yourself as a leader, and so on, I think that as a parent, we need practical tools. Most people just parent out of what they were taught from their own parents. They don't think about a theory they follow or a philosophy they follow, which I encourage people to do this, to follow a particular philosophy, which I think this non-anxious presence one is a good one to follow. But children, think about this. Children don't primarily learn emotional regulation through us teaching it through our words. You know this. They learn through what they see. They learn through what they see. They live their lives through us, the mirroring of us the first few years. When a child is furious and when we tell them no, an anxious parent when we're living in our reactivity and our anxiety, we start over explaining. We start yelling. We start feeling guilty, right? We don't stay grounded and compassionate and emotionally connected. And that's where the real work is, where we learn how to stay connected to our kids through empathy and compassion. And we learn how to stay grounded and separate at the same time through boundaries and through not explaining. And Love and Logic, the type of parenting out there, Love and Logic, does a beautiful job of this. And that's why I think people like Daniel Amen, Dr. Daniel Amen with the Amen Clinics, has pulled in that group into his practice. Because this is a guy who's studied neuroscience in the brain for years and sees the value in this approach. This Love and Logic that came out of this family systems, Murray Bowen type of way of thinking, right? Now think for a second of the parent who's more regulated, more differentiated, more calmer. They might say, I know you're disappointed. I understand. I love you. The answer is still no. You stay grounded. That's maturity. That's parenting. That's leading with being a non-anxious presence, right? The parent validated the emotion, but they didn't surrender the boundary. Validation is not agreement. It's not agreement. I'm going to say that again. Validating a person's experience is not agreement. It just simply communicates, I understand your experience. And guess what? Whether you're a couple and married, whether it's a friend, whether it's your children, whether it's someone you're leading, validating their experience is important. People want to feel heard and seen. It's incredibly important. How much do I talk about that and see that over the years, right? But healthy boundaries still remain in that environment, right? Children, consistently ask questions they never say out loud, if we're honest, right? If we really take a moment and think about that, kids ask questions all the time without saying them out loud in their own mind's eye. Maybe they're not even conscious of these questions. What happens when people disagree? What happens when life is unfair? What happens when someone tells me no? And they learn these answers, as I mentioned, through watching us. Your nervous system becomes your child's first emotional classroom. That is the reality. That's not good news for some of us, is it? Right? That's where they learn. You were teaching people about yourself and about leadership on how you react and how you respond. And one lesson every parent, eventually has to learn is your child's disappointment doesn't automatically mean you made the wrong decision. Many parents confuse guilt with wisdom. That's not the same thing. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do, and loving decision, creates temporary disappointment. Kids are going to feel disappointed. Your staff is going to feel disappointed. Your company is going to feel disappointed. Keep going down the list. They're going to feel disappointed, but you don't let that sway you, right? A healthy parent, going back to the parenting, thinks beyond today's emotion. They think beyond that. They prepare children for adulthood, right? That's important. I mentioned a moment ago just about marriage and relationships, right? When you have a healthy marriage and relationship, you move from you never listen, where your nervous system wants to defend yourself and say, no, I do listen, right? Anxiety's, kind of in charge, and the reactivity and defensiveness. But, when you respond with curiosity, you say things like, it sounds like you're hurting, help me understand, I'm listening. The goal isn't winning. The goal is to stay connected to. But differentiation says that I can remain myself while I stay connected to you. I don't disappear. I don't try to control. I just stay present. Right? And that's the question that I ask couples a lot, is that, am I trying to understand the other, or am I trying to win? Right? One question, encourages conversations. The other does not. Right? So we're pulling some of this together. I know we've got to wrap up here, but some practical ways to grow, I think, is that, how do you become a non-anxious presence? It's not something you just learn overnight. It's a daily practice. You learn habits, things like pausing before responding, learning to take your one breath at a time in those moments where you want to react. You notice your shoulders, right? You notice your shoulders and tightening of your stomach or your shoulders. You relax those. You speak slower. You slow it down. You ask yourself questions like, what am I feeling? What's the story of my anxiety is telling me, right? Is this actually my responsibility? Is this something I need to do about this right now? Do I need to do something, or do I need to let it go and just let this play itself out? Am I trying to manage someone else's emotions? That's an important one. How often do we try to manage other people's emotions and let them just feel what they need to feel and be okay with tolerating that discomfort? Right? Clarifying your values before conflict ever begins. That's important, where you stop and you think about, what are my values before I go into this conversation, right? You know who you are and what you want, right? You know what matters most. You get clarity on that division. You write it out. And as I mentioned, you practice allowing people to be disappointed. So healthy leaders can tolerate other people's discomfort without immediately trying to eliminate it. I know I've said it several times today, but it's worth repeating again. And it applies to parenting, it applies to leadership, it applies to marriage, it applies to friendship, right? So at the end of each day, I would recommend that you ask, what was I most anxious about? How did I respond to that internal anxiety as a leader? What did I learn about that about myself? What was my body trying to tell me? Did I slow down, right? What does wisdom look like? What do I have a vision? I mean, I could keep going, right? All these great questions to be thinking about growth. So in closing, Edwin Friedman, Murray Bowen, these great leaders of our past have taught us that leadership is really more about leading ourselves, right? Leading ourselves first before it's leading others. Before we can lead a business, we've got to lead ourselves. Before we can lead a family, we've got to be able to lead ourselves. Before we can try to change someone else, we've got to learn to regulate ourselves. Before people, because people aren't perfect leaders. You don't need to be a perfect leader. You're not a perfect spouse or a perfect leader or a perfect parent. That's not realistic. The goal is to continue to lean back in to being a person who practices presence, who quietly communicates, we're going to get through this together. I don't have all the answers, but anxiety is not going to lead us today, right? If there's one thought I'd leave you with today, it's this: emotional maturity isn't measured by how calm you are when life is easy. It's measured about how much of yourself you can keep when the people around you are losing themselves. Anxiety is contagious, but being calm is too. And every day, in every conversation, every meeting, every parenting moment, every relationship, we get to choose what we're going to spread: calmness or anxiety. So thanks for listening. This is the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. I appreciate you taking some time to listen to today's episode. If you have a question you'd like to submit, please do so in my bio or on my website. And I'd love to hear from you about any leadership stories in your own life. So again, thanks for being a part of the time, and look forward to talking to you and over chat, online, as well as hearing your questions that are upcoming over the next month. So take care.